My name is Holly Paul. For 29 years, my mother told me I was the reason my twin sister died in the delivery room. She kept a faded pink hospital blanket on the living room mantelpiece, right next to the family portraits I was routinely cropped out of. Every time I set a boundary or asked for basic respect, she would run her fingers over that frayed cotton and whisper that I had taken the oxygen meant for two. She raised me to be a deficit, a defective survivor carrying the weight of a ghost. I believed her. I built my life around paying off a debt I could never clear. I became a senior compliance auditor for a healthcare network in Texas. I hunt down discrepancies. I read balance sheets until the numbers stop lying. But the greatest anomaly I ever found was my own sister's death certificate, signed in a blue gel ink that was not even invented until 3 years after her supposed death. What happened next tore my parents' carefully constructed kingdom down to the studs. Welcome to Savage Revenge Stories. If you have ever been the scapegoat in a family that preferred the golden child, this one is for you. Drop your age and where you are listening from in the comments, and make sure to subscribe. Now let me take you back to the Tuesday night the algorithm cracked my world wide open. I lived in a quiet apartment in Austin. My life was structured around routine data and silence. I preferred it that way. Silence was safe. At 29, I had learned that interacting with my parents, Thomas and Patricia, meant navigating a minefield blindfolded. They reserved their warmth for my older brother, Preston. Preston was an entrepreneur. That is the word my parents used. A more accurate term would be a localized financial crisis. He launched startups that burned through capital and folded within 18 months. Every time he failed, Thomas and Patricia opened their checkbook to bail him out. To them, Preston was a visionary who just needed a break. I was the cold, calculating daughter who asked too many questions. Last Thanksgiving, I drove up to their house in Dallas. Preston sat at the head of the table, swirling scotch over exactly 3 ice cubes. He demanded 3 cubes every time. It was a rigid tick, a need to control the small things, while his larger ventures bled cash. When I declined to invest my own savings into his latest unproven tech app, Patricia set her wine glass down with a sharp click. She turned her gaze to the mantelpiece, to that faded pink blanket trapped under glass. She did not yell. She just let her eyes pool with manufactured grief and said it was a shame the wrong twin survived because my sister would have understood family loyalty. I drove back to Austin that night with my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. Fast forward to a Tuesday in October. It was past 11. Rain tapped against my apartment window. I sat at my kitchen island, bathed in the blue light of my laptop, reviewing vendor compliance logs for a Dallas hospital network. My phone vibrated on the counter. A push notification from Instagram. I rarely used social media, but I kept an account to monitor the healthcare industry pages. I swiped the screen. The algorithm had refreshed the People You May Know carousel. I intended to clear the notification, but my thumb froze hovering over the glass. The 4th profile in the queue belonged to a woman named Harper, living in Denver. Her profile picture was unedited, just a clear shot of her smiling at a coffee shop. I stopped breathing. The air in my kitchen turned thin and metallic. I was looking into a mirror. She had my exact jawline, my exact hazel eyes. But what made the blood rush out of my head was the small, crescent-shaped scar on the left side of her chin. I reached up and touched my own chin, pressing my fingernail into the identical pale crescent I had carried since a childhood bicycle fall. Logic dictates that algorithms match people based on mutual contacts or geographic data. They do not conjure ghosts. I clicked her profile. Her bio listed her birth date, October 14th, my birthday. I opened a new browser tab and ran a basic public records search on her name. She was born in Dallas, Texas, the exact same city. My hands shook as I opened the direct message feature on the app. I did not know what to write. How do you summarize 29 years of mourning someone you were told died before taking a single breath? I typed and deleted 3 different sentences. My chest felt tight, constricted by decades of Patricia telling me I had stolen this woman's life. I settled on a single photograph. I raised my phone, framed my face under the harsh kitchen lighting, making sure the crescent scar was visible, and took a picture. I attached the photo to the message and typed a single line of text. "Do we have the same birthday?" I hit send. I set the phone face down on the granite counter. The silence in the apartment felt heavy, pressing against my eardrums. I stood up to walk away to put distance between myself and the screen. I made it 2 steps before the phone chimed. I picked it up. The small gray typing bubble pulsed at the bottom of the screen. She replied in 11 seconds. "Who are you, and why do you have my face?" That was the text staring back at me from the illuminated screen of my phone. 11 seconds. That was all it took for the algorithm to bridge a gap spanning nearly 3 decades. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I did not type a response. I tapped the video call icon. The phone rang twice. Then the screen rendered a live feed of my own reflection, looking back at me from a dimly lit room in Colorado. We stared at each other in total silence. I watched her chest rise and stop. My own lungs locked at the exact same synchronized second. We were holding our breath in tandem, separated by 900 miles but tethered by an undeniable biology. She had my hazel eyes. She wore her dark hair parted on the same side, and there, on the left side of her chin, sat the pale crescent scar. "You have my scar," she whispered. Her voice carried the same slight, raspy cadence as mine. I traced the mark on my chin. "I was told my twin died at birth," I said. The words tasted like ash. Harper shook her head. The movement was small, rigid. She explained she was adopted through a private agency in Dallas. Her adoptive parents always maintained she was an only child. There was no record of a twin. There was no record of a death. Just a quiet, sterile transfer of a healthy infant from one family to another. The math did not add up. A hospital does not simply misplace a living child. A doctor does not issue a death certificate for a breathing infant without someone signing the paperwork. Before my analytical mind could process the sheer scale of the fraud, my phone vibrated violently against the granite counter. The incoming call screen overrode Harper's face. The contact name read, Patricia. I muted the video feed on my laptop and answered the phone. Patricia did not say hello. She rarely bothered with greetings. She launched straight into logistics. Preston's 30th birthday gala was 3 weeks away. The venue in downtown Dallas required a final catering deposit, $5,000. She stated the amount as if she were asking me to pick up a carton of milk from the grocery store. I stood in my kitchen, the phone pressed to my ear, watching my living, breathing, dead sister on the muted laptop screen. The contrast between the monumental discovery sitting on my desk and the mundane, transactional toxicity echoing in my ear induced a wave of vertigo. "I cannot send you $5,000, I said, keeping my voice level. Through the receiver, I heard the sharp clinking of crystal against ice. Preston was nearby. 3 cubes, his voice echoed in the background, sharp and irritable. I said 3, not 4. My spine stiffened. Preston ordered his scotch with exactly 3 ice cubes. It was a rigid behavioral tic. He clamped down on insignificant environmental variables whenever his corporate ledgers were bleeding. I had seen him do it before his first startup tanked. He would obsess over the temperature of the room or the alignment of the chairs, while his investors prepared to walk away. The demand for 3 cubes meant his current tech venture was drowning. He was not throwing a birthday gala to celebrate. He was throwing a gala to secure a new lifeline of capital from unsuspecting attendees. Patricia sighed into the phone. It was a long-practiced exhalation of a martyr. "Holly, we are not asking for a handout. We are asking for family unity. Your brother is on the verge of a major transition. We all need to support him." "I do not have liquid cash to fund a party," I replied. The line went silent. It was the calculated silence she used to let my disobedience hang in the air, a silent punishment for failing to fall in line. Then came the pivot. She lowered her voice, adopting the fragile tone she reserved for her ultimate weapon. "You are so selfish, Holly," she murmured. "It is a milestone birthday. Your sister would have helped this family. She would have understood what it means to stick together." The blood drained from my face. My stomach twisted into a hard knot. She was invoking the ghost. The ghost I was currently looking at on my muted screen. Patricia was using a woman she claimed was dead to extort money from the daughter she kept alive. The sheer hypocrisy of the tactic made my skin crawl. She had used that phantom sister to keep me compliant for 29 years. "I have to go," I said, and ended the call. I dropped the phone onto the counter. My hands were shaking. I looked back at Harper. She was watching me, her expression a mirror of my own quiet horror. We did not need to speak. The silence stretching between us was louder than any confession. We ended the call with a promise to meet in Denver the next morning. Just as I closed my laptop, a new notification chimed, an email from Preston. The subject line read, "Routine LLC paperwork." The body of the email was brief. He claimed their corporate lawyers needed my signature to finalize the family LLC restructuring before his gala. He framed it as a standard waiver of future dividends meant to simplify the tax bracket for everyone. He requested I review and sign the attached digital document by midnight. I downloaded the PDF. A normal sister might have skimmed the first page and signed the bottom line, trusting her flesh and blood. But I am an auditor. I do not skim. I dissect. I read the foundational clauses. I look for the hidden variables. I scan for the exact paragraph where the intent shifts from mutual benefit to singular extraction. I scrolled past the boilerplate text. I bypassed the standard non-disclosure agreements. I stopped at section 4.2, buried deep within the indemnification paragraphs. I read the section 3 times. The legal jargon was dense, designed to fatigue the reader into compliance. But stripped of its corporate camouflage, the arithmetic was undeniable. This was not a waiver to forfeit future profits. It was a primary assumption of liability clause. The document explicitly stated that the undersigned would assume full fiduciary responsibility for any outstanding credit obligations, operational deficits, and pending litigation associated with the LLC upon execution. Preston was not asking me to step away from the family fortune. He was attempting to tether his sinking ship to my clean credit. If I signed that digital line, I would legally inherit the catastrophic debts of his failing company. He was not asking for a $5,000 party deposit. He was handing me the anchor to his drowning vessel. My own brother was trying to bankrupt me to save himself. The early morning flight from Austin to Denver felt less like a commute and more like crossing a fault line. The cabin air was sterile and dry, carrying the faint metallic scent of recycled jet fuel. I rested my forehead against the scratched acrylic window, watching the flat expanse of the Texas Panhandle give way to the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains. My mind categorized the shifting variables of my existence. A sister breathing in a different time zone. A brother handing me a financial grenade. Parents who had built a domestic shrine to a ghost they knew was living. I gripped the vinyl armrests, trying to ground myself in physical reality. I am an auditor. I deal in ledgers, tax codes, and compliance logs. Without receipts, a theory is just a hallucination. I needed paper. I needed dates, signatures, and official stamps. I was flying to Colorado to audit my own life. We agreed to meet at an independent roaster on the edge of downtown Denver. I arrived 20 minutes early. I needed to secure a corner booth with a clear vantage point of the entrance, facing the door, so I could observe her arrival before she saw me. The shop smelled of bitter espresso and burnt sugar. The ambient noise of the commercial espresso machine provided a steady, white noise, masking the thumping in my chest. At exactly 9:15, the heavy glass door swung open. A woman stepped out of the crisp mountain air. I stopped breathing. Seeing a photograph is one thing. Watching your own face navigate a crowded room, living and breathing in 3 dimensions, is a neurological short circuit. It breaks the brain. Harper wore a structured wool coat, her dark hair pulled back into a severe knot at the nape of her neck. It was the exact same way I wore my hair on audit days. We locked eyes across the room. She walked toward my booth, her steps measured and cautious. She slid into the leather seat across from me. We did not hug. An embrace required a foundation of shared history we simply did not possess yet. Instead, we studied each other, mapping the shared topography of our features in the natural light pouring through the window. The waitress approached, pulling a notepad from her apron. I ordered a black coffee with a single dash of cinnamon. Harper looked at me, her hazel eyes widening slightly. "Make that 2, she said. We sat in silence as the waitress walked away, a quiet, undeniable genetic echo resting on the scratched wooden table. Harper unzipped a battered leather tote bag. She pulled out a thick manila folder and laid it flat on the table between us. "These are the original files my adoptive parents kept," she explained, pushing the stack toward my hands. "They gave them to me when I turned 18. I opened the heavy cardstock cover. The pages were yellowing at the edges, bearing the raised, embossed seal of a Dallas County clerk. I scanned the lines with the practiced eye of a forensic accountant. Date of birth, October 14th, 1996. Transfer of physical custody, October 17th, 1996. 3 days. For 3 days, we shared the same nursery air before our timelines were permanently severed. The adoption was categorized as a private closed placement. The adoptive parents, a wealthy real estate couple from Colorado, paid a staggering premium to bypass standard agency wait lists and protocols. I ran my index finger down the medical history section. It listed a healthy female infant, weight 7 pounds, 2 ounces. There was zero mention of a deceased sibling, no notations of a twin birth in the maternal medical history. The hospital documentation read as if Harper had been born into a vacuum, alone and singular. I thought about the faded pink cotton blanket resting on the mantelpiece in my parents' living room. I thought about the countless birthdays where Patricia would light a single, separate candle and weep for the daughter who never made it out of the delivery room. She had engineered a theater of grief to cover a transaction. My existence was a daily reminder of the crime she committed. That was why she looked at me with such hollow resentment. I was not a daughter to her. I was leftover inventory. I turned my laptop around to face Harper. I brought up the digital document Preston had emailed me the night before. "My brother sent me this while you and I were talking on FaceTime," I said. Harper leaned in, tracing the dense legal paragraphs on the glowing screen. "What am I looking at?" she asked. I pointed to section 4.2. "It is a trap," I explained, tapping the screen. "Preston is spinning a narrative about standard tax restructuring to secure capital for his latest venture. In reality, he is attempting a corporate liability transfer. If I ink my name on that digital signature line, I absorb the entirety of his failing startup debts. He is sinking fast. He is trying to use me as a human shield to protect his personal assets from creditors when his company inevitably files for bankruptcy." Harper sat back, her expression hardening into a cold mask. "They are trying to ruin you while grieving me," she said, her voice laced with quiet fury. "It is a masterful level of sociopathy." We needed to isolate the origin point. How does a hospital issue a death certificate for a child who is simultaneously being transferred to an out-of-state couple? The paperwork had to exist somewhere. A discrepancy of that magnitude leaves a paper trail. I pulled out my phone and logged into the secure portal I used for my healthcare compliance audits. My credentials granted me restricted administrative access to interstate medical archives. I navigated the complex database architecture, reaching the Dallas Hospital System Registry. I requested the archived 1996 microfiche files, cross-referencing our mother's maiden name and our date of birth. I submitted the inquiry, tagging it under a standard procedural compliance review to avoid raising automated federal alarms. We sat in the coffee shop waiting. The ceramic mugs grew cold. The morning rush hour faded into a slow mid-morning low. The suspense gnawed at the lining of my stomach. Erasing a human life from a medical registry is not a clerical error. It requires deliberate, coordinated fraud. Someone had to sign the release forms. Someone had to falsify the vital statistics to satisfy the state health department. We were waiting to see who held the pen. The arithmetic of the crime was forming in my head, but I needed the raw data to prove the formula. 2 hours later, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed the main administrative desk of the Dallas Hospital Records Department. I answered, placing the call on speakerphone so Harper could hear. A woman spoke, her tone clipped and laced with bureaucratic confusion. "Miss Paul, I am looking at the microfiche request you submitted for the birth and death records from October 1996, she said. "There is a problem." I pressed the phone closer to the table. "What kind of problem?" I asked. I heard the sound of mechanical keyboard keys clacking in the background. "The birth record is present," she replied, "but the corresponding death certificate you requested is locked. It was flagged by the state registry office during a routine internal audit 5 years ago. I cannot send it to you." Harper and I exchanged a sharp glance. "Why is it locked?" I demanded, keeping my voice steady. The clerk lowered her voice as if afraid someone in her own office might overhear. "Because the state deemed it administratively void," she said. "The attending physician who signed it was stripped of his medical license for document forgery." I did not hang up the phone. I pressed the clerk for the exact override code required to view restricted administrative flags. She stammered, citing department policy. I calmly read her the specific statute of the Texas Health and Safety Code that grants licensed compliance auditors emergency provisional access during suspected identity fraud investigations. It was a bluff, but it was a highly technical bluff, delivered with the flat, unwavering cadence of someone who fires people for a living. The clerk folded. She typed a sequence of keystrokes, and the digital lock on my portal unlatched. The file populated on my screen. It was a high-resolution scan of the original 1996 death certificate. I turned the laptop so Harper could see. At first glance, the document appeared unremarkable. Standard county seal, typewritten demographic fields, cause of death listed as severe respiratory failure. But my career relies on finding the microscopic fracture in a solid foundation. I zoomed in on the bottom right corner. The attending physician's signature belonged to a Dr. Eris Thorne. I studied the strokes of the pen. The signature was sloppy, hurried, but it was the ink that caught my attention. The pigment was a vibrant, saturated blue, with a distinct pooling effect at the apex of the letter T. I know office supplies. I know document forensics. That specific viscosity belonged to a commercial gel pen. Those specific pens did not saturate the mainstream American market until late 1998. The death certificate was dated October 1996. The ink was an anachronism, a retroactive forgery signed years after the fact to paper over a gaping hole in the hospital registry. I opened a new tab and accessed the Texas Medical Board Public Disciplinary Database. I typed Eris Thorne into the search bar. The results populated instantly, yielding a 40-page tribunal judgment from 1999. Dr. Thorne did not lose his license for medical malpractice. He was stripped of his credentials and federally indicted for falsifying vital records. The board found him guilty of operating as the primary medical conduit for a highly lucrative black market adoption ring. He specialized in ghosting infants from the registry, declaring them deceased or stillborn, so they could be quietly transferred to wealthy buyers outside standard state oversight. I pushed the laptop away. The screen felt radioactive. My parents did not suffer a tragic loss in the delivery room. They executed a transaction. Harper sat frozen, her hands gripping the edges of the wooden table. Her knuckles were white. She stared at the name of the disgraced doctor. "I need to make a phone call," she said, her voice dropping to a hollow whisper. She pulled out her phone and dialed. She put the device on speaker and placed it on the table between us. The line rang 3 times before a woman answered. The voice was warm, seasoned with age. "Hi, sweetheart," the woman said. "Mom, I need you to listen to me carefully," Harper said. Her tone was stripped of all daughterly affection, leaving only a cold, terrifying urgency. I am sitting across from a woman who has my exact face. We share the same birthday. We share the same Dallas hospital. I need you to tell me exactly how you and Dad adopted me. The line went dead quiet. I could hear the faint sound of a television playing in the background of the Denver house. Then came the unmistakable sound of a sharp intake of breath. Harper leaned closer to the microphone. Did you use an agency? A long, agonizing pause followed. The television was abruptly muted. When the adoptive mother finally spoke, her voice trembled, carrying the fragile weight of a secret held for 3 decades. We did not use an agency, Harper. We used a private facilitator, a doctor named Thorne. How much did you pay him? Harper demanded. It was not just the doctor, her mother sobbed, the facade crumbling through the speaker. Your biological parents requested a consulting and placement fee. They set up a limited liability company to receive the funds. We wired the money 3 days after you were born. How much I interjected, unable to keep the sheer disgust out of my voice. There was a rustling on the other end. A man took the phone. Harper's adoptive father. His voice was thick with shame. $500,000, he confessed. They told us they were drowning in debt. They said they could only afford to keep 1 child. We wanted you so badly, Harper. We justified the payment as a private donation to give you a better life. We signed non-disclosure agreements. We never asked questions. Harper ended the call. She did not say goodbye. The coffee shop around us faded into a muted blur. The arithmetic of our existence was laid bare on the scratched table. $500,000. That was the exact price tag my parents placed on a human life. My mind raced backward, sifting through decades of domestic history. Why sell a child? Why engineer such a convoluted, heartless crime just for cash? The answer lay in the darkest corners of Patricia's psychology. Patricia was a product of the state foster system. She spent her entire childhood bouncing between underfunded group homes, carrying her belongings in trash bags. She grew up with a visceral, desperate hunger for control. When she met Thomas, she saw an opportunity to build a fortress of upper-middle-class perfection. She became obsessed with the aesthetic of a pristine, curated suburban kingdom. Everything had to be symmetrical. Everything had to be manageable. A twin pregnancy shattered her carefully constructed illusion. Twins were chaotic. Twins were loud, expensive, and unpredictable. 1 child was a manageable accessory that fit neatly into her bourgeois fantasy. 2 children constituted a loss of control. She did not sell Harper out of desperation. She sold her out of vanity. She capitalized on her own pregnancy, extracting $500,000 of untraceable cash to buy the sprawling Dallas house with the grand stone mantelpiece. The same mantelpiece where she currently displayed the pink hospital blanket. She used the phantom memory of a dead infant to secure unwavering sympathy from her country club friends, while secretly using the blood money to fund Preston's elite private school tuition. My parents were not grieving survivors. They were human traffickers operating behind the gates of a manicured subdivision. I looked at Harper. A single tear tracked down her cheek, crossing the crescent scar on her chin. We were 2 halves of a ledger that had been deliberately corrupted. One sister sold for seed capital, the other kept as a psychological punching bag to absorb the residual guilt. Before either of us could articulate the profound horror of the revelation, my phone screen illuminated. It was not a text message or an email. It was a high-priority alert from the security camera app synced to the front door of my Austin apartment. The application chimed a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the heavy silence of the coffee shop. I tapped the notification, bringing up the live video feed. The wide-angle lens captured the sterile hallway of my apartment complex. 2 figures stood on my welcome mat, Thomas and Patricia. My father was pacing the narrow corridor, his face flushed a deep mottled red. He repeatedly checked his wristwatch, radiating an agitated, volatile energy. Patricia stood directly in front of the camera. She was clutching her designer handbag, her knuckles white. She raised her fist and hammered against my wooden door. The sound of her knuckles striking the wood transmitted through the live audio feed, echoing harshly from my phone speaker. "Holly, open this door," Patricia shouted, her voice shrill and echoing in the empty hallway. "We know you are in there. Preston needs that liability waiver signed today." She pounded the wood again. The curated country club mother was gone, replaced by a panicked, desperate creditor. They were 900 miles away, but their toxic urgency flooded the coffee shop. They were hunting me. They needed my signature to save Preston from the financial ruin he had engineered. They needed me to sacrifice my own future to protect the golden child, just as they had sacrificed Harper to build their kingdom. I watched my mother glare into the camera lens, her eyes dark and frantic. The trap was closing. I left Harper in Denver with a promise to unravel the rest of the thread. The flight back to Texas was a study in compartmentalization. I needed to interact with the architects of my lifelong misery without letting my facial expressions betray the truth. My profession trains me to sit across polished mahogany tables from corporate embezzlers and smile while calculating their federal prison sentences. This situation required the exact same rigorous discipline. I landed in Austin, retrieved my car, and drove back to my apartment complex, preparing my mind for a siege. I arrived to find my parents pacing the lobby of my building. Patricia wore her signature cashmere cardigan draped over her shoulders. Thomas repeatedly checked his luxury wristwatch, projecting an aura of volatile impatience. I approached them, maintaining a flat, neutral gaze. I unlocked my front door and gestured for them to step inside my private space. Patricia wasted 0 seconds. She bypassed the standard pleasantries and sank directly into my linen sofa, pulling a delicate lace handkerchief from her designer purse. The theatrical performance initiated before the front door even clicked shut. She dabbed her dry eyes. Her voice dropped a full octave, coating her words in a thick layer of synthetic sorrow. "Holly, you must try to understand the immense pressure we are enduring," she whispered. "Preston turns 30 next week." She let out a trembling, measured breath. 30 years. It marks 3 decades without our lost angel. The agonizing pain of missing your twin sister is tearing the fabric of this family apart. We just need to finalize this corporate transition so your brother can find a sliver of peace. Hearing my mother invoke the infant she brokered for $500,000 was a masterclass in psychological warfare. My stomach churned. A sharp, metallic taste flooded the back of my throat. I stood a few feet away, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, the distinct lack of genuine tears, the calculated tilt of her chin. She anticipated my compliance. She expected me to crumble, to fold under the suffocating weight of the phantom twin I had mourned my entire life. Instead, I walked over to the kitchen island and poured a glass of cold water. I leaned against the marble counter and locked eyes with both of them. I read the digital document Preston emailed me. I said, keeping my vocal cords relaxed and even, "I cannot sign it today." Thomas snapped his head up. His posture stiffened, discarding his usual quiet demeanor. "Why not?" he demanded. "It is a simple administrative waiver." I took a slow, deliberate sip of water. My accountant flagged several alarming tax concerns regarding the indemnification clauses, I replied, assuming the operational debts of Preston's tech company could severely shift my personal tax bracket and expose my assets to creditor litigation. I need an independent third-party legal review before I authorize any transfer of liability. The word accountant acted like a spark in a room full of gasoline. The fragile, grieving mother routine evaporated in a millisecond. Patricia lowered her handkerchief, her eyes narrowing into cold, calculating slits. But it was Thomas who truly lost his composure. My father, a man who spent his entire adult life projecting unshakable country club authority, stood up so fast his knee slammed into the wooden coffee table. "You ungrateful little brat," he spat. A thick vein pulsed visibly at his temple. "We gave you everything. We sheltered you. We fed you. and you decide to drag your feet when your own brother desperately needs your support? I observed him carefully. He was sweating. A thin sheen of perspiration coated his upper lip. His hands trembled as he pointed an accusing finger at my chest. This was not the righteous anger of a disappointed parent. This was the raw, unfiltered terror of a cornered debtor facing a catastrophic margin call. They were out of time. The facade was crumbling. "If you do not sign that digital ledger by tomorrow morning," Thomas threatened, stepping closer, "I will cut you out of this family permanently. We will have you declared a mental liability. You have always been unstable, Holly, always living in the dark shadows. Do not think I will hesitate to protect my son from your erratic behavior." A mental liability. The specific phrasing echoed in my mind. They were threatening to use my lifelong depression, the very trauma they deliberately engineered, as a legal weapon to strip my autonomy. They wanted to paint me as insane to force a signature. I did not flinch. I held my ground, maintaining the detached, clinical gaze of a forensic investigator completing a hostile intake interview. "I will send the revised notes when my counsel finishes reading the fine print," I replied, refusing to grant them an inch of emotional ground. Patricia stood up, smoothing her skirt with sharp, jerky movements. "You are breaking your brother's heart," she hissed. They turned and marched out of my apartment. The heavy front door slammed shut behind them, sealing the welcome silence back inside my home. I did not waste a single moment. I walked straight into my home office and booted up my primary dual-monitor workstation. I needed to understand what Preston was trying so frantically to protect. If his software startup was bleeding cash, why did the family holding company possess so much value to them? What was the underlying hidden asset? I opened the PDF file Preston sent me. I copied the employer identification number listed at the top header of the waiver. Using a secure commercial database access point I maintain for hospital compliance audits, I cross-referenced the corporate registration. The entity was registered in Delaware, a classic maneuvers utilized to obscure primary ownership. I pulled the initial filing documents, checking the registered agents and the listed addresses. The primary funding source for Preston's sinking company was not venture capital. It was not a network of angel investors. The digital ledger displayed a continuous series of structured wire transfers originating from a secondary holding company. I traced the routing numbers tunneling through complex layers of obfuscated accounts. Each corporate layer I peeled back revealed another shell, another ghost entity designed to launder the origin of the capital flow. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clicking forming a steady drumbeat in the quiet room. I hit the bedrock foundation at 2 a.m. The final routing sequence terminated at a private wealth management firm headquartered in Houston. I opened the unredacted origin file. The organization Preston was using as a piggy bank was not funded by his non-existent entrepreneurial genius. It was a direct subsidiary tethered to an obscure Texas oil trust. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, reading the establishment date, 1990. The grantor was listed clearly in bold, black letters. My late grandfather. I was staring at a multi-million-dollar financial instrument I never knew existed. Harper arrived at Austin Bergstrom International Airport just past noon. I stood by the baggage claim watching my own face navigate the crowd. We did not waste time on pleasantries or sightseeing. The gravity of the ledger we were about to open required no soundtrack. We had a scheduled appointment downtown with Warren Davis. Davis was a corporate estate litigator who treated family law like a hostile takeover. He did not operate with empathy. He operated with surgical precision, dismantling corrupt trusts and recovering hidden assets for high net worth clients. I liked him immediately. We sat across from him in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the Colorado River. Davis did not offer us coffee or water. He simply unclasped his leather briefcase and extracted a heavy bound stack of legal paper. The cover page bore the embossed seal of a Houston wealth management firm and a date stamped in 1990. My grandfather had drafted this instrument 3 years prior to his passing. Davis pushed the stack toward the center of the polished mahogany table. Your grandfather was a highly pragmatic man, Davis began, his voice flat and measured. He amassed significant capital in the oil sector, but he harbored deep suspicions regarding your mother. He viewed Patricia as a financial liability. To protect his lineage, he bypassed his own son and structured this generation-skipping trust. I opened the leather cover. My eyes scanned the pristine, typewritten pages, pulling the structural variables into focus. The core directive was stark. My grandfather allocated a dedicated principal of $15 million to each individual living grandchild. The funds were locked in impenetrable, high-yield accounts, designated to vest only upon the beneficiary reaching their 30th birthday. I traced the lines with my index finger, calculating the compound interest. Then I reached Section 7.4, the reversion clause. I read the paragraph aloud, my voice echoing off the glass walls. In the event of a beneficiary perishing prior to the age of 30, the designated principal shall revert to the immediate administrative control of the surviving parents. Harper stopped breathing. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving the crescent scar on her chin stark and pronounced. She stared at the paper, her mind processing the true depth of the betrayal. They did not just sell me to bypass an agency waitlist. Harper whispered, the realization fracturing her composure. They sold me to unlock the trust. The sheer scale of the fraud clicked into place. Patricia and Thomas brokered Harper for $500,000 in untraceable cash. But that initial payment was merely the entry fee. By bribing a disgraced doctor to forge a death certificate, they triggered the reversion clause. They convinced the financial executors that an infant had died in the delivery room, granting them unfettered access to Harper's $15 million. They spent the next 29 years bleeding a dead girl's trust fund dry. They funneled the stolen capital into country club memberships, luxury vehicles, and Preston's endless parade of failing business ventures. Harper was not just a discarded daughter. She was their primary revenue stream. But one variable remained unexplained. I looked up at Davis. How did I find her? I asked. An Instagram algorithm does not spontaneously bridge a closed adoption and a forged death certificate. The system matched our faces on a random Tuesday. The statistical probability of that happening organically is 0. Davis permitted himself a tight, grim smile. He reached into his briefcase and produced a secondary file thinner than the first. He slid it across the table. Your grandfather did not trust the people he left behind, Davis said. He owned a subsidiary data firm in the late 80s. Before he died, he enlisted his top engineers to construct a contingency protocol, a digital dead man's switch. I opened the thin folder. It contained lines of dense proprietary code and a summary execution brief. He embedded a dormant search algorithm within the trust's holding company, Davis explained. For decades, it sat quietly scraping emerging digital infrastructures, public records, facial recognition databases, and social media indices. It was programmed with a singular activation threshold. It would only execute when the surviving heirs approached their 29th year and their digital footprints crossed specific geographic boundaries. My grandfather anticipated the deception. He built a ghost in the machine to ensure the ledger would eventually reconcile itself. When Harper and I turned 29, the algorithm woke up. It detected identical biometric markers in 2 different time zones and quietly manipulated a targeted advertisement protocol to place her profile directly into my social feed. The dead man's switch worked flawlessly. We sat in the silence of the conference room, the weight of a dead man's protective genius settling over us. But the brilliant revelation was immediately overshadowed by a ticking clock. My 30th birthday was exactly 9 days away. My own $15 million was about to vest. Once I hit that chronological milestone, the capital would transfer directly into my sole legal possession. Thomas and Patricia would lose all access. This was the catalyst driving their frantic behavior. Harper's stolen trust was exhausted. Preston had burned through the final reserves to prop up his current tech startup, which I now knew was nothing more than a hollow Ponzi scheme. They were facing imminent financial ruin. The LLC liability waiver Preston had emailed me was their desperate endgame. If they could trick me into signing that digital document, they would essentially hijack my vesting capital. They needed me to assume Preston's toxic debts so they could intercept the $15 million before it reached my bank account. If I refused to sign, their entire house of cards would collapse under the weight of federal audits and furious creditors. We left Davis with a clear strategy. We needed to freeze the remaining assets and prepare subpoenas for the forged medical records. I felt a cold, sharp clarity taking root in my chest. I was no longer the defective survivor walking on eggshells. I was an auditor, and I was going to liquidate their facade. I drove Harper back to my apartment and headed straight to my corporate office to finalize some quarterly compliance reports. I needed to maintain my daily routine to avoid tipping off Preston. But my brother was not a passive adversary. He possessed a desperate, cunning instinct. Preston monitored the back-end security logs of the family holding company. He must have seen the digital footprints of my forensic trace from the night before. He knew I had bypassed his shell companies and discovered the grandfather's trust. He knew the trap was failing. I was sitting in my cubicle, parsing a set of medical billing codes, when my desk phone rang. It was the Director of Human Resources requesting my immediate presence in the executive boardroom. I walked down the carpeted hallway, sensing a shift in the atmospheric pressure of the office. Colleagues averted their eyes as I passed. When I entered the boardroom, the Regional Director of Compliance and the Head of Human Resources were sitting across from a thick printed dossier. They did not offer me a seat. We received an urgent external communication this morning. The HR director stated, her tone laced with severe professional caution. An anonymous whistleblower complaint was filed against your credentialing number. I kept my posture rigid. A complaint regarding what? The compliance director folded his hands over the dossier. The complaint alleges severe breaches of patient confidentiality and HIPAA protocols. The filer claims you have been utilizing restricted hospital databases to conduct unauthorized personal investigations. Furthermore, the individual submitted a detailed character assessment suggesting you are experiencing an acute psychological breakdown, rendering you a critical liability to this firm. My pulse drummed a slow, steady rhythm against my throat. I recognized the strategy instantly. It was Preston. He was executing a preemptive strike. He knew I possessed the capability to expose his fraudulent empire. To neutralize my threat, he sought to obliterate my professional credibility. If he could brand me as an unstable, disgruntled employee terminated for federal privacy violations, no financial investigator would ever believe my claims regarding a stolen trust and a forged death certificate. He was trying to silence the auditor before she could publish the report. I stood in the sterile boardroom staring at the fabricated dossier designed to destroy my career, realizing my family was willing to bury me alive to protect their stolen wealth. The executive boardroom felt like a sensory deprivation chamber. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady drone masking the ambient noise of the corporate office beyond the frosted glass walls. I sat across the polished mahogany table from Elaine, the Director of Human Resources, and Marcus, the Regional Head of Compliance. Between us sat a thick manila folder holding the anonymous whistleblower complaint. Elaine adjusted her glasses, her posture rigid, radiating institutional discomfort. The allegations in this file are severe, Holly, she stated, keeping her voice modulated and precise. The claimant asserts you utilized secure company portals to bypass HIPAA regulations, accessing restricted patient registries for personal motives. The file also contains character affidavits, suggesting you are experiencing a severe psychological break. They claim your current mental state poses a critical risk to patient data integrity. I looked at the dossier. Preston had crafted a venomous narrative. He understood that in the corporate sector, the mere accusation of data mishandling is often enough to trigger an immediate suspension. If I were suspended pending investigation, I would lose my system credentials. I would lose my income. More importantly, I would lose my professional standing. If I attempted to expose his stolen trust fund or the forged death certificate, he would simply point to this HR file as proof that I was a disgruntled, erratic former employee seeking revenge through paranoid delusions. He expected me to react the way family members react during domestic disputes. He expected me to raise my voice, to deny the charges with frantic emotion, to act like a cornered victim. But Preston forgot who he was dealing with. I do not operate on emotion. I operate on receipts. I reached into my tailored blazer pocket and retrieved a small digital audio recorder. I placed the metallic device on the center of the mahogany table and pressed the red record button. A tiny crimson light blinked to life. As a senior auditor conducting an intake interview regarding my own credentialing, I am initiating a formal recording to ensure procedural accuracy, I said. My voice was flat, devoid of any defensive inflection. Marcus shifted in his leather chair, the subtle squeak echoing in the quiet room. He uncrossed his arms, clearly unnerved by my clinical detachment. I opened my briefcase and extracted my own bound folder. I slid it across the table, aligning it perfectly parallel to the anonymous dossier. You received a complaint alleging unauthorized database access. I began looking directly into Elaine's eyes. I have printed the master server access logs for my credential identification, covering the last 90 days. You will find every single query time-stamped and cross-referenced. Elaine opened my folder. Page 4, I instructed. I accessed the Dallas Hospital Registry yesterday morning at 9:14. That query was executed under Emergency Provisional Access Code 73 Alpha. It is a federal statute permitting auditors to bypass standard request queues when investigating suspected synthetic identity fraud. Marcus leaned forward, inspecting the document. You are claiming you opened an active identity fraud investigation? He asked. I am claiming that I located a death certificate in the Dallas archives, signed by a physician who was stripped of his medical license for federal document forgery 3 years after the document was allegedly issued, I replied. My tone remained frigid. The hospital administration has already flagged the file as administratively void. My query was not a HIPAA violation. It was the discovery of a Class A felony. I secured the data using the exact security protocols this company pays me to enforce. Elaine flipped the page, her eyes scanning the columns of hexadecimal server data. As for the psychological assessment, I continued steepling my fingers on the table. Entertaining an anonymous, unverified character attack violates Section 4.2 of our own Corporate Human Resources Bylaws. However, to save us all time, please refer to page 12 of my folder. It is a certified psychological evaluation I passed 3 weeks ago to maintain my Tier 1 clearance for the Federal Health Database. I am legally classified as fit for duty. I leaned forward, closing the physical distance between us. The individual who filed that complaint used a proxy server to mask their location. But if you subpoena the internet service provider, you will find the original outgoing connection originated from a commercial suite in downtown Dallas. The exact suite leased by my brother Preston Paul. He is currently facing catastrophic corporate insolvency and is attempting to preemptively destroy my career to prevent me from exposing his financial crimes. Elaine closed my folder. The silence in the boardroom stretched thick and heavy. I had dismantled a carefully orchestrated smear campaign in under 10 minutes, using their own compliance manuals as a weapon. We will archive the anonymous complaint, Elaine finally said, her shoulders dropping. Your credentials remain active, Holly. Thank you for your thorough documentation. I retrieved my audio recorder, stopped the capture, and walked out of the boardroom. I maintained my rigid posture until the elevator doors closed, sealing me inside the stainless steel car. Only then did I let my shoulders fall. The adrenaline receded, leaving a cold, hollow ache behind my ribs. The victory felt like ash. I had saved my career, but the emotional toll of the attack was suffocating. My own brother had attempted to economically assassinate me. My parents had co-signed the execution. They did not care if I lost my apartment, my livelihood, or my sanity, as long as their stolen wealth remained secure. I drove back to my apartment, gripping the steering wheel so tight the leather groaned under my hands. When I unlocked my front door, I found Harper pacing the length of my living room. She had spent the afternoon analyzing the printed trust documents Davis provided. Her dark hair was loose, falling over her shoulders, and her jaw was set in a tight, furious line. She took one look at my face and stopped pacing. "What happened?" she asked. I placed my keys on the counter. Preston filed a fabricated HR complaint to have me terminated and branded as psychologically unfit, I said. I cleared the investigation, but he is escalating. They know the 30th birthday deadline is approaching. Harper's eyes flashed with a dangerous, intense heat. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. "Call Davis," she demanded, her voice vibrating with rage. "We are filing an injunction right now. We sue them for defamation. We sue them for the forged medical records. We freeze every single bank account they possess, and we drag them through a decade of discovery hearings until they are begging for bankruptcy." I walked into the kitchen and poured 2 glasses of water. I handed one to my sister. I watched the water tremble in the glass, matching the tremor in her hand. I shook my head. "A lawsuit is exactly what they want," I explained. Harper stared at me, uncomprehending. Why would they want a lawsuit? "Because lawsuits happen behind closed doors," I said, leaning against the marble island. "If we sue them, Thomas will hire a fleet of defense attorneys. They will file endless motions to delay the proceedings. They will draft ironclad non-disclosure agreements. They will offer a quiet settlement and bury the truth under a mountain of sealed court records. They thrive in the shadows, Harper." Patricia has spent 30 years controlling the narrative through whispers and gated community gossip. If we fight them in a courtroom, she will spin a story about greedy, ungrateful daughters trying to extort their grieving parents. I took a slow sip of water, letting the cold liquid ground my thoughts. The strategy was crystallizing in my mind, taking the shape of a flawless audit. "We do not sue them," I continued, meeting her gaze. "We expose them. We strip away the shadows and turn on the floodlights." Preston is hosting a massive launch gala in Dallas this weekend. He invited 300 of the wealthiest venture capitalists in Texas. He intends to stand on a stage and project an image of untouchable success. Patricia intends to play the role of the devoted mother. Harper lowered her glass, her breathing slowed, mirroring my own calculated rhythm. "You want to audit them in public?" she whispered. "I want a complete reconciliation of the balance sheet," I confirmed. "But to get them onto that stage feeling safe and victorious, we have to make them believe they have already won. They need to believe the HR attack worked. They need to think I am broken." I pulled my phone from my pocket. I opened my messaging application and created a new group text including Preston Thomas and Patricia. I stared at the blank text field, tasting the bitter metallic flavor of the lie I was about to type. I crafted the persona of a defeated, cowed daughter. I typed with deliberate hesitation, channeling the exhaustion they expected to inflict. "I am sorry for being difficult this week," I wrote. "The HR investigation terrified me. I cannot afford to lose my job, and I cannot fight this family anymore. I will attend the gala in Dallas this weekend to support Preston. Have the corporate lawyers bring the LLC waiver to the venue. I will sign the liability transfer in front of everyone." I read the text twice, ensuring the tone was perfectly calibrated to stroke their egos. It was a surrender flag, woven from pure deception. I pressed send. The message vanished into the digital ether, traveling across the state to land directly in their palms. I set the phone on the counter and looked at Harper. A slow, chilling smile spread across her face, highlighting the crescent scar we shared. The trap was set. The air in Warren Davis's conference room tasted like ozone and expensive leather. It carried the distinct atmospheric pressure of a brewing storm. The polished mahogany table was buried under layers of wire transfer printouts, penal code indices, and the unredacted medical history files I had liberated from the Dallas registry. We were no longer simply reviewing a family dispute. We were constructing a federal indictment. Special Agent Kessler sat across from me. She represented the white-collar division of the Federal Bureau, specializing in interstate financial crimes. She did not offer sympathetic smiles or polite platitudes. She spoke in statute seizure protocols and asset liquidation timelines. Her presence transformed our theoretical defense into a tactical, offensive strike. Davis steepled his fingers, resting his chin on his knuckles. "The financial fraud alone warrants a federal inquiry," he stated, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "The unlawful absorption of Harper's $15 million trust constitutes grand larceny." However, the introduction of the forged death certificate elevates the entire operation. It transitions the crime from civil trust embezzlement to a Class A federal felony. We are looking at wire fraud conspiracy and the falsification of vital state records. Agent Kessler tapped a silver pen against her notepad. "We require a contained environment to execute the asset freeze," she explained, her gaze locking onto mine. "Your parents have retained a formidable team of corporate defense attorneys to handle your brother's LLC transition. If my agents serve the subpoenas to Thomas and Patricia at their private residence, they will immediately telephone that legal counsel. Those attorneys possess the authorization and the infrastructure to route the remaining trust capital into untraceable offshore accounts before my department can lock the domestic routing numbers. We cannot afford a single minute of latency." I leaned forward, analyzing the logistical variables. I offered the solution. "The launch gala," I said. Preston requested his entire legal team attend the event tonight to finalize the LLC liability waiver he expects me to sign. He wants the transition completed in front of his investors to project fiscal stability. Davis nodded, a sharp, predatory glint in his eye. "Serving the federal freeze on the ballroom floor isolates the parents and their attorneys simultaneously," he confirmed. "It initiates a real-time institutional lockdown. They cannot wire funds if their phones are confiscated and their lawyers are standing inside a federal perimeter." The strategy was set. The arithmetic was flawless. We adjourned the meeting to prepare for the evening. Leaving the downtown law office, the Texas sky bruised into a deep violet. Harper and I walked in silence down South Congress Avenue, entering a high-end designer boutique. We bypassed the subtle neutral tones and the muted fabrics. We were not attending a party to blend into the background. We required armor. We required a visual statement that would fracture the psychological foundation of the gala the second we entered the room. We found it in a pair of identical emerald green silk dresses. The fabric caught the overhead lighting, projecting a cold, sharp elegance. Standing side by side in the dressing room mirror, we aligned our reflections. The crescent scars on our chins mirrored each other, a permanent biological receipt proving our shared origin. Harper ran her hands down the smooth silk, her posture faltering for a fraction of a second. The reality of walking into a room to confront the people who had monetized her existence settled heavily over her shoulders. She looked at me, her reflection trembling. "Holly, what if they find a loophole?" she asked, her voice tightening with residual anxiety. "What if they spin the narrative and the investors believe them?" I reached out and adjusted the structured collar of her emerald dress. "They operate in shadows, Harper," I reminded her, maintaining a steady, unyielding tone. "We are bringing the stadium lights. This is not about vengeance or emotion. It is basic arithmetic. They falsified the ledger, and we are the reconciliation. You do not owe loyalty or fear to the people who erased you." She took a slow, deep breath, her spine straightening. The hesitation evaporated, replaced by a cold, enduring resolve. We purchased the dresses and finalized the timeline. The morning of the gala, I drove up Interstate 35 to Dallas alone. Harper remained hidden at a secure hotel, waiting for Davis and Agent Kessler to mobilize. I needed to execute the decoy phase. I had to maintain the persona of the defeated, compliant daughter, ready to sign away her future. To sell the performance, I parked my car in the pristine, circular driveway of my childhood home. The sprawling brick exterior stood as a testament to synthetic perfection. The manicured lawn was cut to a geometric exactness. Every brick, every window pane, every meticulously pruned rosebush was purchased with human trafficking money. It was a fortress built on a forged death certificate. I unlocked the heavy mahogany front door with the silver key I still carried on my ring. The interior was dead quiet. Patricia was at a downtown salon receiving her theatrical makeup and blowout for the evening. Thomas was likely at the hotel ballroom, inspecting floral arrangements and micromanaging the catering staff. The house smelled of expensive lemon polish and sterile conditioned air. I walked directly into the formal living room. My footsteps sank into the thick, imported Persian rug, muting my approach. My eyes tracked straight to the towering limestone mantelpiece, the domestic shrine. There, nestled inside a custom glass shadow box, rested the faded pink cotton blanket. For nearly 3 decades, Patricia had weaponized this specific piece of fabric. She touched the glass when she needed to manufacture a tear for her country club friends. She referenced the frayed cotton whenever I demanded basic human dignity, twisting my perfectly valid boundaries into an insult against a dead infant. It was the physical anchor of her fabricated trauma, a prop she used to keep me perpetually indebted to a ghost. I reached up and unlatched the brass hook on the shadow box. The hinges released with a soft, metallic click. I reached inside and pulled the blanket free. The cotton felt coarse, degraded by time and trapped dust. I carried the fabric into the kitchen, spreading it flat under the harsh glare of the pendant lights. Something about the weight of the blanket had always bothered my analytical mind during my childhood. A specific hem near the bottom right corner felt unusually stiff, much thicker than standard hospital textiles. I opened my leather travel bag and retrieved a small metal seam ripper from an emergency sewing kit. I inserted the sharp curved blade under the vintage white thread holding the hem together. I severed the first stitch. The fabric yielded. I cut another and another. I worked with the steady, deliberate precision of a forensic examiner opening a corrupted seal. The seam parted, revealing a hollow, dark pocket hidden inside the double lining. I slid my index finger into the narrow gap. My nail scraped against something rigid and synthetic. It was not woven fabric. It was plastic. I pinched the edge and pulled the hidden object out into the harsh kitchen light. 2 translucent hospital wristbands clattered onto the white marble counter. The air in the room evaporated. I stared at the tiny plastic bands designed to encircle the fragile wrists of newborns. They were pristine, protected from the elements by the cotton shroud for 29 years. I leaned closer, reading the faded black ink printed on the identification labels. The first band bore my name, Holly Paul. The second band bore the distinct medical designation Baby Girl B. My lungs seized as my eyes scanned the secondary diagnostic field printed squarely below the names. It did not read deceased. It did not list respiratory failure or vital collapse. Stamped in clear, unmistakable block letters across both plastic bands were 2 identical words: healthy, discharged. Patricia had not kept the pink blanket to mourn a tragic loss. She had kept it to conceal the primary evidence. It was a sick, triumphant trophy of her flawless crime, hidden in plain sight inside the very shrine she used to torment me. I secured the 2 plastic hospital wristbands inside the silk lining of my evening clutch. The clasp snapped shut, sealing 29 years of concealed evidence into the palm of my hand. I walked out of that suffocating suburban fortress and drove downtown. The Dallas skyline glowed against the dark horizon, a grid of illuminated steel and glass, projecting wealth and ambition. I navigated toward the luxury hotel anchoring the financial district. I handed my car keys to the valet and stepped through the revolving brass doors. The grand ballroom was a monument to excess. It dripped in old Texas oil money and new venture capital. Cavernous ceilings housed tiered crystal chandeliers that cast a warm golden hue over 300 high society investors. Twin ice sculptures flanked the main entrance, carved into the shape of soaring falcons, slowly weeping freezing water into silver catch basins. In the far corner, a live string quartet played a frantic, urgent movement of classical music, attempting to score the illusion of prestige. Waitstaff in crisp white jackets circulated through the crowd, balancing trays of seared wagyu and flutes of vintage champagne. It was a glittering facade designed to separate rich fools from their capital. I stood near a towering arrangement of white orchids and located my brother. Preston held court near the center of the room. He wore a bespoke velvet tuxedo that fit his frame with tailored precision. From a distance, he projected the aura of a visionary founder on the brink of a monumental public offering. But I possessed the training to look closer. I watched the subtle, rigid tension in his jaw. I tracked the rapid, darting movement of his eyes as he scanned the perimeter. He held a heavy, crystal tumbler of scotch. I watched him swirl the amber liquid, listening to the distinct clink of exactly 3 ice cubes striking the glass. The obsessive behavioral tic betrayed his internal panic. He nodded at an older, silver-haired investor, clapping the man on the shoulder and flashing a brilliant, rehearsed smile. Preston was promising exponential returns on cutting-edge software integration. I knew the truth. His entire tech startup was a hollow Ponzi scheme. There was no proprietary code. There was no revolutionary algorithm. His operation was a financial black hole, sustained entirely by the evaporating fumes of Harper's stolen trust fund. For years, he had paid early investors with the capital drained from my sister's legacy. Now the trust was tapped out. The accounts were dry. This gala was his desperate final maneuver to reel in fresh victims and keep the fragile pyramid from collapsing. I stepped further into the ballroom, the emerald silk of my dress catching the chandelier light. I did not attempt to blend into the shadows. I walked with the measured, deliberate cadence of an auditor entering a hostile boardroom. It took less than 30 seconds for Thomas and Patricia to spot me. They detached themselves from a circle of wealthy socialites and intercepted me near the bar. Thomas wore a stiff tuxedo, his face flushed with the kind of frantic heat that accompanies impending ruin. Patricia was draped in diamonds and a tailored couture gown that armored her fragile ego. They did not greet me. They did not smile. Thomas grabbed my elbow, steering me away from the center of the room. His grip was tight, bruising, digging into the silk sleeve of my dress. They flanked me, acting as a physical barrier to prevent any guest from initiating conversation. They marched me toward the darkest periphery of the ballroom. We arrived at a round table draped in black linen, positioned near the kitchen service doors. It was table 14, the designated quarantine zone. 2 men in dark suits waited at the table. They were corporate defense attorneys representing the family holding company. They sat with predatory stillness, surrounded by leather folios and printed ledgers. One of them slid a glowing digital tablet across the black linen tablecloth. The screen displayed the final page of the LLC liability transition waiver. A small blinking cursor waited on the signature line. Patricia leaned in close to my ear. The cloying scent of her expensive floral perfume masked the sharp, sour odor of her desperation. "Do not embarrass us tonight, Holly," she whispered, her voice dripping with concentrated venom. "You have already caused enough disruption. Sit down, sign the electronic papers, and you can leave through the service exit." She expected me to shrink. She anticipated the familiar childhood response where I would lower my eyes, apologize for taking up space, and submit to her demands to keep the peace. She thought the overwhelming opulence of the room and the intimidating presence of the lawyers would force my compliance. I remained a stone wall. I looked at the glowing tablet, then looked directly into Patricia's eyes. I was no longer the defective survivor mourning a ghost. I was the reconciliation. Their corrupted ledger was about to run red, and I held the pen. I reached over and picked up a glass of sparkling water from the table. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The carbonation popped sharply against my tongue, a grounding physical sensation in a room built on lies. I will review the terms after the speeches conclude, I said, keeping my tone frigid and flat. I want to hear what my brother has to say. Thomas gritted his teeth, leaning over the table. You will sign this document right now, he hissed. I set the glass down. The base clicked against the wood. If you pressure me, I will turn around, walk to the center of the dance floor, and loudly explain to your investors why I require independent counsel to review a liability transfer, I replied. The threat paralyzed them. They could not risk a public spectacle. Patricia smoothed the front of her couture gown, her hands trembling with suppressed fury. She exchanged a panicked glance with the senior attorney, who gave a slight nod indicating they should wait. They were trapped by their own need for a seamless performance. Fine Patricia snapped. But you do not move from this table. They retreated, rejoining the glittering crowd, leaving me guarded by the two silent lawyers. I sat in the shadowed corner and watched the illusion hold the room hostage. 300 wealthy guests laughed and drank, entirely unaware they were funding a criminal enterprise run by human traffickers. The ambient noise shifted. The string quartet stopped playing. The overhead chandeliers dimmed, plunging the audience into a theatrical twilight. A bright, piercing spotlight illuminated the main stage at the front of the cavernous hall. Preston stepped into the light. He adjusted the microphone stand, gripping the metal pole with white knuckles. He smiled, projecting the ultimate image of a triumphant founder. He welcomed the crowd, his voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. He spun a masterful narrative about innovation disruption and the future of technology. Tonight marks a monumental transition for our enterprise. Preston announced, raising his crystal tumbler, we are consolidating our holding companies to streamline our upcoming expansion. The crowd murmured with approving interest. But none of this would be possible without the bedrock of my family. Preston continued, placing his hand over his heart. He gestured toward the front row. I want to publicly thank my parents, Thomas and Patricia Paul. They provided the seed capital for my dreams. They taught me the true meaning of unwavering integrity. The ballroom erupted into polite, sustained applause. Investors raised their glasses toward Thomas and Patricia, who smiled and waved, basking in the fraudulent adoration. Preston lowered his head, letting the applause wash over him. And now, he said, stepping back from the microphone, I would like to invite my mother to the stage to share a few words about the journey that brought us here today. Patricia stood up. She smoothed her diamonds and ascended the short staircase to the stage. She took the microphone, her face projected onto two massive digital screens flanking the podium. She paused, taking a trembling, theatrical breath. She lowered her eyes, preparing to deliver the tearful dedication to the infant she sold 29 years ago. Patricia adjusted the microphone. The harsh white spotlight tracked her movements, casting long shadows across the velvet curtains behind the podium. She stood before 300 of the wealthiest individuals in Texas, a captive audience waiting for the matriarch to speak. She retrieved a delicate embroidered handkerchief from her clutch. She did not wipe her eyes, because there were no tears to clear. She simply pressed the fabric against her lower lash line, a calculated physical cue designed to prime the room for sorrow. The acoustics of the ballroom amplified her slow, shuddering breath. The clatter of silverware against fine china ceased. The entire hall fell into a reverent hush. 29 years ago, Patricia began, her voice modulated to a fragile, trembling pitch. Thomas and I faced the darkest hour a parent can endure. She let the words hang. The silence in the cavernous space deepened. We walked into a delivery room expecting a double blessing. We walked out with a shattered world. She bowed her head. The performance was flawless. She had rehearsed this cadence for 3 decades, refining the pauses, perfecting the exact angle of her chin to catch the ambient light. She was selling a ghost story to fund a criminal enterprise. I sat in the dim periphery at table 14. The air felt thick, heavy, with the unearned sympathy of the crowd. I watched the digital monitors magnifying my mother's face. My analytical training forced me to catalog the discrepancies between her narrative and the receipts secured in my purse. I knew exactly what happened in that delivery room. She did not lose a child. She negotiated a price. She brokered an infant for $500,000 in untraceable consulting fees to bypass a private agency wait list. I had the 2 plastic wristbands safe inside my silk clutch. Both marked healthy and discharged. But the audience did not possess the forensic data. They only had her theatrical sorrow. Patricia gripped the edges of the podium, projecting a facade of maternal strength. Losing an infant changes the structural foundation of a family. She continued, looking directly at the front row where Preston stood. His posture was rigid, his hand gripping his scotch glass. It forces you to rebuild from the ashes. It forces you to cherish the children who remain. Preston, my brilliant son, you took that foundational grief and transformed it into innovation. You built this company on the resilience we learned in the dark. The sheer audacity paralyzed my lungs. She was weaponizing a fabricated tragedy to underwrite corporate fraud. Preston's software venture did not stem from resilience. It stemmed from the $15 million they hijacked by bribing a disgraced physician to sign a forged death certificate. Patricia used the capital from the initial human trafficking transaction to buy the limestone mantelpiece where she staged her daily mourning. Then they used the fake death to trigger the reversion clause in my grandfather's oil trust, bleeding Harper's legacy dry over 3 decades. Now she was leveraging that same phantom child to secure fresh capital from unsuspecting venture capitalists to cover their staggering deficits. Then Patricia turned her head. The spotlight caught the diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. She peered into the shadowed perimeter of the ballroom, her eyes searching until they locked onto table 14. The camera operator followed her gaze, projecting my image onto the digital screens flanking the stage. And of course, Patricia murmured, her tone shifting from reverent to patronizing, "We have our surviving girl, Holly." The crowd pivoted. Hundreds of pairs of eyes found me sitting between the 2 defense attorneys. I did not shrink. I kept my spine straight, the emerald silk of my dress catching the low light. I maintained a frigid, neutral expression, refusing to offer them the vulnerable reaction they craved. Holly tries her best to navigate this complex world. Patricia cooed, painting me as a fragile, incompetent dependent. She carries the heavy burden of being the one who lived. The guilt can be overwhelming for her. We brought her here tonight to show her that despite her ongoing struggles, she will always have a safe place in our shadow. A low collective sigh rippled through the audience. Women in couture gowns touched their chests. Men in bespoke suits nodded with somber respect. They were manipulated eating out of the palm of a master illusionist. The dramatic irony tasted like copper on my tongue. They saw a devoted mother offering grace to a defective daughter. They did not know the defective daughter was a senior compliance auditor holding the match that would burn this entire fraudulent empire to the ground. The senior attorney seated to my left tapped his gold watch. He nudged the glowing digital tablet closer to my hands. The cursor blinked steadily on the liability transition waiver. "The speeches are concluding, Ms. Paul," he whispered, his voice a dry, impatient rustle. "Your father expects the authorization finalized before the dessert service. Sign the screen." He pushed a digital stylus across the black linen tablecloth. The plastic cylinder rolled and hit the base of my water glass. If I picked up that pen, I would inherit Preston's catastrophic debt. I would assume fiduciary responsibility for a hollow shell company tethered to a stolen oil trust. I would become the legal scapegoat for 3 decades of embezzlement, ensuring my own $15 million trust fund would be drained the moment it vested next week. The attorneys believed they had me cornered, boxed in by the immense social pressure of a high society event. They assumed I lacked the spine to disrupt the pristine choreography of the evening. They thought the spotlight and the sheer volume of wealthy witnesses would force my compliance. Patricia signaled for a waiter. A silver tray was brought to the podium. She lifted a crystal flute of champagne, holding it high above her head. The overhead lights caught the bubbles, turning the glass into a beacon of false victory. The culmination of a 30-year lie concentrated into a single toast. Please, everyone, raise your glasses. Patricia projected her voice ringing clear and triumphant over the silent ballroom. To Preston, to the future, and most importantly, she smiled a cold, predatory curve of her lips, to the family that survived. 300 glasses rose in unison. The clinking of crystal echoed through the cavernous space. The string quartet readied their instruments to play a celebratory chord. The senior attorney leaned closer, his finger tapping the glowing signature line on the tablet. The illusion was at its peak. The ledger was balanced entirely on a fabricated narrative. I did not reach for the stylus. I reached under the dark tablecloth and pulled my phone from the hidden pocket of my dress. The screen was already unlocked. I opened the encrypted messaging application connected to Attorney Davis and Special Agent Kessler. They were waiting in a black federal SUV idling in the loading dock outside the service entrance. The engine was running. The subpoenas were printed. The asset freeze authorizations were signed by a federal judge. The financial dragnet was loaded and ready to deploy. I stared at the blinking cursor in the text field. I looked up at the stage, watching Patricia sip her champagne, basking in the stolen glory of a child she discarded for cash. I looked at Preston, raising his glass of scotch, confident his toxic debts were about to become my problem. I typed a single one-word text. Now. I pressed send. The text vanished from my screen, leaving only the confirmation notification. I slipped the phone back into the hidden pocket of my dress. I kept my eyes locked on the heavy oak doors at the back of the cavernous ballroom. I knew the precise distance from the loading dock to the main entrance. I mentally counted the seconds matching the rhythm of the ticking clock that had governed my life for 29 years. 10 seconds. The crowd continued to hold their champagne flutes high, the collective breath of the room suspended in a fabricated reverence. Patricia smiled from the podium, soaking in the fraudulent validation. 15 seconds. Preston adjusted the cuff of his velvet tuxedo, preparing to step forward and accept the toast, the golden child ready to claim his stolen inheritance. 20 seconds. The heavy brass handles of the oak doors turned. The doors swung inward with a solid, hollow thud that reverberated over the ambient noise. The string quartet, positioned near the entrance, dragged their bows across their instruments, resulting in a discordant, screeching halt. The sudden absence of music was jarring, a sudden vacuum in the carefully curated atmosphere. Harper walked through the threshold. She wore the identical emerald green silk dress. Her dark hair was styled exactly like mine, pulled back to expose the sharp angles of her jaw. She did not hesitate. She did not look at the 300 guests turning in their chairs. She walked with a cold, measured stride directly down the center aisle of the ballroom, illuminated by the ambient glow of the chandeliers. The visual shockwave hit the room like a physical blow. The wealthy investors, the socialites, the corporate lawyers, they all froze. The collective confusion was palpable. They looked from Harper walking down the aisle to my face projected on the massive digital screens flanking the stage, and back again. We were a flawless, undeniable mirror image. The crescent scar on her chin caught the light, a biological receipt rendering the entire narrative on stage obsolete. On the stage, the facade shattered. Patricia stared down the center aisle. Her mouth opened, but her vocal cords refused to engage. The microphone slipped from her trembling fingers. It plummeted, hitting the polished marble floor with a horrifying metallic screech that echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system. The sharp feedback caused guests in the front rows to wince and cover their ears. Patricia did not move to retrieve it. She stood paralyzed, her couture gown suddenly looking like a straitjacket. Preston's rigid control dissolved in a fraction of a second. The crystal tumbler slipped from his grip, shattering against the stage floor. 3 ice cubes skittered across the polished wood. His jaw went slack, his eyes wide with a frantic, uncomprehending terror. The golden boy, the visionary founder, was reduced to a panicked animal caught in a snare he did not understand. Thomas, positioned near the curtain line, went completely pale. The blood drained from his face, leaving a grayish pallor. He stumbled backward, his heel catching the edge of a monitor cable, breaking his carefully maintained country club posture. He braced himself against the velvet drapes, looking at the ghost of his own making, marching toward him. There was no screaming. There was no dramatic hair-pulling or theatrical gasps. The silence was absolute. The devastation was clean, surgical, and undeniable. I stood up from table 14. The two corporate attorneys beside me remained seated, their legal folios forgotten, their faces locked in expressions of profound shock. I did not look at them. I walked away from the shadowed periphery, stepping into the illuminated center aisle. Harper slowed her pace as I approached. We met in the exact center of the ballroom, surrounded by 300 silent witnesses. I turned facing the stage and stood shoulder to shoulder with the sister they claimed died before taking a single breath. The visual impact of two identical women wearing identical emerald silk, standing in defiance of a 30-year lie, was staggering. The arithmetic was balanced. The ghost was solid flesh and bone. Patricia gripped the edges of the podium, her knuckles stark white against the dark wood. She opened her mouth, her mind frantically searching for a narrative to contain the fallout. I could see the gears turning behind her eyes, the desperate attempt to formulate a lie that could explain away the impossible realities standing before her. She did not get the chance. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open again. Attorney Warren Davis stepped through the threshold. He wore a sharp charcoal suit, carrying a thick, heavy manila folder. He did not look like a guest. He looked like an executioner. Directly behind him walked Special Agent Kessler. She was flanked by two uniformed federal officers. Kessler did not blend into the opulent surroundings. Her presence was a stark, jarring reminder of federal authority disrupting the insulated world of Texas oil money. She carried a leather portfolio, her gaze sweeping the room with cold, calculating precision. The murmurs began then. Low, frantic whispers rippling through the crowd as the investors recognized the unmistakable posture of federal law enforcement. Cell phones were quietly pulled from tuxedo pockets. Wives leaned into their husbands, exchanging panicked glances. The Golden Gala was rapidly devolving into a crime scene. Davis walked down the center aisle, his hard leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. He bypassed the tables of frozen guests, walking directly toward the two corporate defense attorneys sitting at table 14. He did not introduce himself. He did not offer professional courtesies. He slammed the heavy manila folder onto the black linen tablecloth, scattering their pristine legal ledgers. The contents spilled out. The voided death certificate from the Dallas Hospital Registry, the 40-page leather-bound trust document drafted by my grandfather, and the high-resolution photographs of the two plastic hospital wristbands, both marked healthy and discharged. The senior defense attorney stared at the documents, his face draining of color, as the reality of his client's actions crystallized. He looked at the forged medical record, then up at the stage, realizing he had been drafted to execute a liability transfer based on a foundation of federal wire fraud and human trafficking. He slowly closed his laptop, separating himself from the liability unfolding in real time. Agent Kessler did not stop at table 14. She bypassed the legal perimeter and walked straight toward the main stage. Her two uniformed officers fanned out, securing the primary exit routes, preventing any individual from quietly slipping away. She stopped at the base of the stage, looking up at Thomas, Patricia, and Preston. The illusion was over. The floodlights were on. The shadows where Patricia had operated for 29 years were eradicated by the harsh, unforgiving glare of objective reality. The ledger was open, and the auditors were holding the pen. Agent Kessler unclasped her leather portfolio, extracting a sheaf of documents bearing the official seal of a federal magistrate judge. She looked directly at Thomas, her voice projecting clearly across the silent ballroom, requiring no microphone to command the space. Agent Kessler did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her words carried the frigid weight of federal authority, slicing through the stagnant air of the ballroom. She addressed Thomas, Patricia, and Preston simultaneously, presenting the official subpoenas. You are hereby served with federal grand jury subpoenas regarding an ongoing investigation into interstate wire fraud, grand larceny, and the falsification of vital state records, Kessler announced. Do not attempt to leave the premises. Do not attempt to access any digital financial portals. Every electronic device in your possession will be confiscated pending forensic review. The murmurs in the crowd escalated into a cacophony of panicked realization. Investors shoved their chairs back, scrambling to distance themselves from the radioactive center of the room. Spouses gripped each other's arms, their eyes darting toward the exits guarded by the uniformed officers. The high society gala had instantly mutated into a containment zone. Attorney Davis stood at table 14, standing over the two pale corporate defense lawyers. He did not yell. He simply laid the evidence flat on the black linen. The voided Dallas death certificate, the grandfather's original 1990 trust provisions, and the high-resolution photographs of the translucent hospital wristbands. Your clients requested you draft a liability transfer tonight, Davis said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. That transfer relied on the premise of a deceased beneficiary. I am informing you as an officer of the court that the beneficiary is alive and currently standing in the center of this room. Your clients engaged you to facilitate a transaction using stolen federal funds. I suggest you reconsider your representation immediately. The senior defense attorney stared at the documents, his hands trembling. He looked at the forged medical record, then up at the stage where Patricia stood frozen in her couture gown. He closed his leather folio, snapped his briefcase shut, and stood up. He did not say a word to Thomas or Patricia. He simply walked away, severing the legal tether to a sinking ship. I did not wait for the dust to settle. The ledger was open, but it was not yet balanced. I bypassed the fleeing investors navigating the chaos with the focused precision of a senior compliance auditor executing a hostile review. I ascended the short staircase to the main stage. Preston stumbled backward, his velvet tuxedo suddenly looking cheap and oversized. He stared at me, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. I bent down and retrieved the microphone Patricia had dropped. The metal casing was dented, but the audio feed remained active. I walked to the podium, brushing past my mother, who stood paralyzed, her chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. I unzipped the side pocket of my emerald silk dress and withdrew a specialized connection cable. I plugged one end into the podium's AV matrix and connected the other to my encrypted digital tablet. The two massive screens flanking the stage flickered. The looping graphic of Preston's software logo vanished. In its place, the screens projected a high-resolution scan of the 1996 forged death certificate signed in the anachronistic blue gel ink. Can everyone please direct their attention to the screens, I requested, speaking into the microphone. My voice echoed through the chaotic ballroom, flat, authoritative, devoid of the emotional hysteria they expected. We are going to conduct a live reconciliation of the balance sheet. The remaining investors stopped moving. The sheer audacity of the projection anchored them to the floor. They stared at the towering image of the falsified medical document. For 29 years, my parents utilized this forged document to trigger a reversion clause in a multi-million-dollar Texas oil trust. I explained, highlighting the signature block on the screen with my tablet stylus. They bribed a disgraced physician to declare an infant dead, bypassing standard adoption queues and hijacking $15 million intended for the child standing in the center aisle. I tapped the screen. The image shifted. The death certificate was replaced by a complex flowchart mapping a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore routing numbers. That stolen capital did not sit idle. I continued tracing the red lines connecting the fraudulent accounts. My parents bled the trust dry, funneling the stolen legacy into real estate country club memberships and the primary operational budget for the company you were invited to invest in tonight. The crowd gasped. The sound was distinct, a sharp intake of breath from 300 wealthy individuals simultaneously realizing they were holding shares in a criminal enterprise. I tapped the screen a third time. The flowchart vanished, replaced by Preston's current corporate banking ledgers. The rows were highlighted in stark, glaring red. My brother's tech startup does not possess proprietary software, I stated, staring directly into the crowd of venture capitalists. He does not possess a revolutionary algorithm. His entire operation is a classic Ponzi structure sustained entirely by the evaporating fumes of a stolen trust fund. The accounts are currently overdrawn by $7 million. He invited you here tonight to secure fresh capital to cover his catastrophic deficits. Preston's jaw clamped shut. His face morphed from terror to a deep, mottled crimson. He took a staggering step forward, raising his hands as if he could physically pull the damning numbers down from the screens. "She is lying," he screamed, his voice cracking under the strain. "She is a disgruntled liability. She is trying to ruin my life." I did not flinch. I kept my gaze fixed on the audience. "The arithmetic is projected before you," I said. "The numbers do not possess an agenda. The numbers simply state the truth." Agent Kessler stepped onto the stage, holding a heavy manila folder. She approached Preston, presenting a secondary legal document. Her expression remained entirely neutral, immune to his frantic outburst. "Preston Paul," she announced, her voice cutting through his panic. "As a direct result of the federal fraud investigation, the Securities and Exchange Commission has initiated an emergency asset freeze on your holding companies. Because the collateral used to secure your operational loans was derived from stolen trust funds, the bank is executing an instant margin call on all associated accounts, effective immediately." The words hit Preston like a physical strike. An instant margin call. His creditors would immediately demand full repayment of the massive loans he secured using the stolen trust money. His company was not just bankrupt, it was mathematically obliterated. He lost his remaining shreds of control. The golden child, the visionary founder, snapped under the weight of objective reality. "You ruined everything," Preston roared, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He lunged across the stage, closing the distance between the podium and my position. His hands curled into fists, his eyes wild and unfocused. He intended to physically assault the auditor who exposed his ledger. He did not reach me. Harper moved with a sudden, fluid grace. She ascended the stage stairs in 3 rapid steps, interposing herself between Preston and the podium. She did not raise her hands defensively. She did not shrink. She stood her ground, her posture mirroring my own rigid defiance. She wore the identical emerald dress, projecting a solid, impenetrable wall of shared identity. Preston skidded to a halt, his momentum broken by the sudden appearance of the ghost he had funded his life with. He stared at Harper, his chest heaving, unable to process the biological reality standing mere inches from his face. Harper looked our brother dead in the eye. The crescent scar on her chin caught the harsh stage lighting. "She did not ruin your life," Preston Harper stated, her voice carrying the cold, quiet finality of a closing account. "The math did." Harper did not flinch. She did not break eye contact. She stood between Preston and the podium, an immovable force anchored by 29 years of erased existence. She delivered a line of pure ice. "She did not ruin your life," Preston Harper stated, her voice carrying the cold, quiet finality of a closing account. "The math did." Preston's mouth opened, but the sheer, undeniable logic of the statement paralyzed his vocal cords. He looked from Harper to the massive digital screens displaying his catastrophic ledgers, and back again. The golden boy, the localized financial crisis, was finally forced to confront the deficit he had created. He staggered backward, his velvet tuxedo blending into the shadows of the stage curtain. The ballroom descended into frantic, chaotic movement. The wealthy venture capitalists, the high society elites, the individuals who had raised their champagne flutes mere minutes ago were now fleeing the perimeter. Chairs screeched against the marble floor. Cell phones were pressed to ears as investors frantically dialed their own private attorneys, attempting to sever their ties to a federally indicted Ponzi scheme. The Golden Gala had mutated into an active crime scene. The string quartet had abandoned their instruments, leaving behind a scattered arrangement of cellos and violins. Tomas descended the short staircase from the stage, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. His stiff, formal posture was gone, replaced by the hollow, trembling gait of a man watching his empire evaporate. He navigated the scattering crowd, walking directly toward me. He reached out a trembling hand in the cuff of his tuxedo shirt, stained with a drop of spilled champagne. "Holly," he stammered, his voice thin, cracking under the immense pressure of the federal dragnet. "Holly, please, you have to understand. We were protecting the family's legacy. The trust, it was complicated. We did what we had to do." I looked at the man standing before me. This was the father who had enabled my mother's psychological warfare for 3 decades. He was the quiet architect of my misery, the man who allowed me to believe I was a defective variable, while he secretly funded his golden child with human trafficking money. He expected me to react with anger or sorrow. He anticipated an emotional outburst he could manipulate. I felt nothing. The anger had burned off, leaving a cool, clean detachment. I signaled to a passing waiter who was frozen near the ice sculptures holding a silver tray. I calmly set my untouched glass of sparkling water onto the polished metal surface. The glass clicked, a small, sharp sound, finalizing the transaction. I turned back to Thomas. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the precise, unwavering cadence of a senior auditor delivering a final, irreconcilable verdict. "You did not just steal money," I told him, meeting his frantic gaze. "The financial fraud is the least offensive crime you committed. You stole a lifetime of sisterhood. You monetized a human life and weaponized a ghost to keep me compliant. You did not protect a legacy. You built a prison." Thomas lowered his hand, his eyes filling with a desperate, shallow panic. "But we are family," he pleaded, invoking the hollow word they had used to cage me. "We are a corrupted ledger," I corrected, stepping back, establishing a physical and psychological perimeter. "And the account is closed." I did not offer forgiveness. I did not accept his pathetic, stammering apology. I established a permanent, impenetrable boundary. I turned my back on the man who had erased my twin and walked away. Harper met me at the base of the stage. We did not need to speak. We linked arms, a united front forged in the crucible of a 30-year lie. We walked down the center aisle, navigating the chaotic remnants of the Dallas Gala. Behind us, the federal perimeter tightened. Agent Kessler directed her uniformed officers, instructing them to secure the stage. I heard the sharp, metallic click of handcuffs, a sound that resonated with poetic finality. Thomas and Patricia were being detained, their cell phones confiscated, their assets frozen. The bourgeois facade they had murdered to maintain was reduced to a public spectacle of federal indictments. We walked through the heavy brass doors of the luxury hotel and stepped out into the humid Texas night. The air felt different. It was no longer suffocating or heavy. It felt expansive. We climbed into the waiting black SUV. Attorney Davis sat in the front passenger seat, reviewing a stack of printed legal filings. He glanced in the rearview mirror, offering a sharp, grim nod of approval. "The margin calls are executing as we speak," Davis confirmed, tapping his leather briefcase. "Preston's LLC is locked. The holding company is frozen. The secondary shell accounts are being systematically liquidated by the federal investigators." I leaned my head against the cool, tinted glass of the window, watching the Dallas skyline recede as the driver navigated onto the interstate. The adrenaline began to ebb, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. But beneath the fatigue, a new sensation took root. It was the quiet, steady pulse of autonomy. I was no longer a defective survivor. I was a sovereign individual. Harper rested her head on my shoulder. The physical contact was unfamiliar, but instinctively right. We had a lifetime of shared history to build. We had 29 years of missed birthdays, unspoken secrets, and shared genetics to explore. But the ledger was not entirely settled. My 30th birthday was exactly 48 hours away. When the clock struck midnight on Thursday, the restrictive clauses of my grandfather's original 1990 trust would expire. The $15 million held in the impenetrable high-yield accounts would automatically vest, transferring directly into my sole legal possession. Thomas and Patricia had gambled everything to intercept that capital before the deadline. They had failed. However, the financial mechanics of Preston's liability waiver remained in play. The digital document he had emailed me, the trap designed to shift his catastrophic corporate debts onto my personal balance sheet, was still active in the legal ether. Preston and his corporate defense attorneys had drafted a highly specialized indemnification clause. They had weaponized the legal language, intending to use my signature to force me to absorb the toxic assets. They assumed I was an oblivious target. They forgot I was an auditor. They forgot that a contract drafted to transfer liability can be mathematically reversed if you control the primary variables. I opened my encrypted tablet illuminating the dark interior of the SUV. I accessed the digital ledger Preston had sent. I did not intend to sign it. I intended to rewrite it. I possessed the routing numbers. I possessed the foundational corporate bylaws of the family holding company. And thanks to the federal asset freeze, I possessed the operational leverage. I began to type, executing a sophisticated financial maneuver that would ensure Preston and my parents experienced the exact devastation they had planned for me. 60 days is a trivial measurement of time in the context of a human lifespan, but in the realm of federal justice and high finance, 60 days is an eternity. It is enough time to systematically deconstruct a kingdom built on 30 years of fraud. 2 months after the disastrous gala in Dallas, the federal indictments were unsealed. The Department of Justice does not operate with emotion or theatrical flair. They operate with binding statutes and mandatory minimums. Thomas and Patricia Paul were formally charged with interstate wire fraud, conspiracy to commit grand larceny, and human trafficking. The inclusion of the trafficking charge was a direct result of the forged vital records used to broker a human being across state lines for $500,000. Their passports were confiscated. Their bank accounts remained in a deep, unyielding freeze. They were relegated to the status of criminal defendants, waiting for a trial date that would inevitably end in federal prison sentences. But the federal penal system is slow. Financial ruin is swift. The true poetic justice did not come from a judge hitting a wooden gavel. It came from the paperwork itself. On the night of the gala, sitting in the back of the federal SUV, I had opened the digital LLC transition waiver Preston emailed me. His corporate attorneys drafted that document, intending to trap an uninformed signatory. They buried a liability transfer deep within the indemnification clauses, hoping I would blindly sign my name and absorb his toxic $7 million deficit. They fundamentally underestimated their opponent. I am a senior compliance auditor. I read the structural load of a contract the way an engineer reads a blueprint. I located a reciprocal guarantor provision hidden in Section 4.2. The clause stipulated that if the primary designated signatory rejected the liability transfer with prejudice, citing fraudulent misrepresentation, the operational debts automatically reverted to the primary shareholders of the holding company. Thomas and Patricia were listed as the sole primary shareholders of the shell entity funding Preston's startup. I did not simply reject the document. I countersigned the rejection, executing the reciprocal clause, and appended the federal subpoena as my legal justification for fraudulent intent. By digitally filing that revised contract with the state registry, I triggered a cascading default. I successfully transferred the entirety of Preston's catastrophic corporate debts directly onto Thomas and Patricia's personal estate. The arithmetic executed without mercy. The bank managing their primary accounts registered the $7 million deficit. Because the stolen trust capital they previously used as collateral was now under federal lock, the bank issued an immediate margin call. Thomas and Patricia had 48 hours to produce liquid cash they no longer possessed. When the deadline expired, the bank initiated full asset forfeiture. The eviction took place on a humid Tuesday morning. Hoping to escape the relentless Dallas press, Thomas and Patricia had retreated to their secondary luxury estate in Austin. The sprawling modern mansion sat on 2 acres of prime hill country real estate. It was a secondary fortress of glass and limestone, purchased with the residual interest of Harper's stolen legacy. I parked my car a block away, watching the scene unfold through the windshield. A fleet of flatbed tow trucks and moving vans clogged the manicured driveway. The repossession was being handled by Apex Recovery Solutions. The irony was profound. 5 years prior, when I refused to co-sign a predatory loan for Preston, my parents hired that exact same ruthless debt collection firm to harass me. They used Apex to flood my phone with threatening calls and intimidate my landlord, hoping to terrify me into compliance. Now the agents of Apex were carrying Patricia's custom Italian leather sofas out the front door. I watched 2 men in heavy work shirts load her prized collection of contemporary art into the back of a sterile white box truck. Another crew secured Thomas's luxury sedans onto the flatbeds, the heavy steel chains clanking against the asphalt. Thomas stood on the pristine front lawn, wearing wrinkled slacks, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. Patricia stood beside him, stripped of her diamonds and her couture armor. She wore a simple gray sweater, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She watched her curated bourgeois facade being dismantled piece by piece, carted away to satisfy the exact debts her golden child had accumulated. They were left standing on the curb, holding small overnight bags. They had nothing left. The ledger was swept clean. Preston experienced his own distinct variation of gravity. Stripped of his stolen seed capital and unearned prestige, he was forced to enter the actual workforce. His network of venture capitalists had evaporated overnight, treating his name like a contagion. Without his parents' checkbook to bail him out, he faced the immediate, undeniable pressure of monthly rent. I utilized my industry contacts to track his employment status. The former visionary founder was currently working as an entry-level sales associate for a mid-tier logistics software company. He sat in a cramped gray cubicle surrounded by the humming drone of fluorescent overhead lights. He spent 9 hours a day wearing a cheap polyester button-down shirt, reading from a laminated script, making cold calls to uninterested supply chain managers. There were no crystal tumblers. There was no scotch poured over exactly 3 ice cubes. There was only the grueling, humiliating reality of a strict commission structure and a manager who penalized him for taking extended lunch breaks. The Golden Boy was finally experiencing the crushing weight of ordinary consequence. While their world contracted, our world expanded. October 14th arrived carrying the crisp, cool air of early autumn. Harper and I turned 30 years old. We celebrated quietly in my apartment, a stark contrast to the hollow opulence of the Dallas Gowa. We ordered takeout from a local Thai restaurant and sat on my linen sofa drinking black coffee with a dash of cinnamon. At exactly midnight, the restrictive clauses of my grandfather's original 1990 trust expired. I opened the secure banking application on my encrypted tablet. The screen refreshed. A notification chimed a soft, pleasant digital tone. The primary holding account unlocked. $15 million transferred directly into my sole legal possession. The numbers populated on the screen a long string of zeros, representing a lifetime of financial autonomy. Harper experienced a similar victory earlier that week. Attorney Davis had successfully petitioned the federal magistrate overseeing the fraud case. The court issued an expedited restitution order. The $15 million Thomas and Patricia had hijacked 29 years prior was officially restored to its rightful beneficiary. Harper reclaimed her stolen legacy, the funds secure in an account untainted by our parents' greed. We sat together, looking at the glowing screen. We were financially independent. We were untethered from the toxic narrative that had defined our early lives. We possessed the resources to build our own foundations, to travel, to invest, to simply exist without apologizing for taking up space. The defective survivor and the phantom ghost had inherited the earth. The silence in the apartment felt different now. It was not the heavy, oppressive silence of secrets and unspoken resentments. It was the calm, steady quiet of a reconciled balance sheet. But the past possesses a stubborn instinct. It always attempts one final negotiation, refusing to accept the finality of a closed account. The following afternoon, I walked down to the lobby of my apartment building to check the centralized mailbox. I retrieved a stack of mundane envelopes, filtering through utility bills and grocery store circulars. Near the bottom of the stack, I found a thick, cream-colored envelope. There was no return address printed in the top left corner. But I did not need a return address. I recognized the handwriting instantly. The elegant looping cursive strokes, the precise pressure of the fountain pen, the distinct stylistic flourish on the capital letters. It was a letter from Patricia. I stood in the sterile lobby holding the heavy envelope. I could feel the residual manipulation radiating through the paper. It was a desperate correspondence sent from a woman who had lost her kingdom, her wealth, and her primary scapegoat. She was trying to reach across the impenetrable boundary I had constructed, probing for a weakness, searching for a fractured seam in my armor. I carried the thick, cream-colored envelope upstairs and set it on the edge of my kitchen island. I did not open it. I did not throw it away immediately. I simply let it sit there for 3 days, allowing its presence to test the structural integrity of my new life. In the past, a letter from Patricia would have dictated my heart rate. It would have sent a spike of cortisol through my veins, triggering the conditioned response of the defective survivor waiting to be scolded. Now, it was just paper. It held the same emotional weight as a discarded receipt. I had purchased a new home in the hills west of Austin. It was a cash transaction finalized the week my grandfather's trust vested. I chose the architecture deliberately. The house featured soaring ceilings, exposed cedar beams, and floor-to-ceiling glass windows that faced the eastern sunrise. There were no dark corridors. There were no ornate limestone mantelpieces designed to hold shadows or secrets. The floor plan was open, transparent, and flooded with natural light. It was the physical manifestation of a clean ledger. On a quiet Sunday morning, I sat on the wide, wraparound wooden porch. The Texas air carried the crisp, cool signature of late autumn. The rustle of the ancient oak trees bordering the property provided a steady, calming white noise. The screen door squeaked open behind me. Harper walked out onto the porch carrying 2 large ceramic mugs. She wore oversized gray sweatpants and a faded college sweatshirt, her dark hair tied up in a messy knot. She looked relaxed, unburdened. The tense, guarded posture she carried during the first weeks of our reunion had entirely dissolved. She handed me a mug and sank into the Adirondack chair across from me. We sat in a comfortable, companionable silence. I held the warm ceramic against my palms, breathing in the rising steam. It was dark roast, black coffee, layered with a single distinct dash of cinnamon. The genetic echo remained intact. We did not need to fill the quiet air with constant chatter. The silence between us was no longer a void waiting to be filled by parental demands. It was a foundation we were building upon, day by day. I set my mug on the small cedar table between our chairs. Beside the mug lay the unopened letter from Patricia. Harper glanced at the cream-colored envelope. She did not ask what it was. The looping, elegant, cursive handwriting on the front was a dead giveaway. She took a slow sip of her coffee, her hazel eyes tracking my face, studying my reaction. "Are you going to read it?" she asked, her voice quiet, blending with the rustle of the oak leaves. I looked down at the envelope. I traced the psychological profile of the woman who wrote it through the pressure of the ink. Patricia used a heavy, expensive fountain pen. The strokes were deliberate, designed to project sophistication and control. But I knew the reality of her current circumstances. She was facing federal indictment. Her assets were seized. Her country club peers had abandoned her, and she was living in a rented apartment while awaiting a criminal trial. I did not need to break the wax seal to know the contents of the pages inside. "It is a toxic asset," I explained, leaning back in my chair. "It is formatted to look like an apology, but it is actually a demand. She is trying to negotiate a settlement. She will start by acknowledging the pain she caused, phrasing it carefully to avoid admitting direct legal fault. Then she will pivot, She will talk about family bonds. She will remind me of the few scattered, decent memories from my childhood, utilizing nostalgia as a crowbar to pry open my boundaries. Finally, she will present the invoice. She will ask for financial assistance for legal fees or for a character reference ahead of her sentencing. I picked up the envelope, testing its weight. It contained at least 3 pages of dense manipulation. If I read the words I continued meeting Harper's steady gaze, I give the liability a foothold on my balance sheet. Reading it validates her assumption that she still holds a seat at my table. She expects me to consume her guilt and process her shame. But I am no longer operating in her deficit. Harper nodded a slow, profound gesture of understanding. She raised her mug, taking another sip, the steam curling around the crescent scar on her chin. I stood up from the Adirondack chair, carrying the envelope inside the house. I walked past the sunlit kitchen and entered my home office. The room was organized and sterile, featuring a wide glass desk and a dual-monitor workstation. Beneath the desk sat a heavy-duty cross-cut paper shredder. I did not pause to reconsider. I did not hold the envelope to my chest or indulge in a final moment of theatrical sorrow. I pressed the power button on the machine. The internal gears hummed to life, a low mechanical growl waiting for input. I fed the unopened envelope into the narrow metal slot. The steel blades caught the thick paper. The machine whirred loudly, pulling the cursive handwriting, the expensive cream cardstock, and the desperate, unread lies down into the grinding mechanism. In less than 4 seconds, the entire correspondence was reduced to a pile of illegible confetti in the plastic waste bin. The physical destruction of the letter finalized the audit. The ledger was zeroed out. The balance sheet was permanently reconciled. I turned off the machine and walked back out to the porch. The morning sun had climbed higher, cutting through the canopy of the oak trees, bathing the wooden deck in a warm, golden light. I sat back down across from my sister and picked up my coffee. The air tasted cleaner. The crushing, suffocating burden of the defective survivor was gone. I had carried that phantom weight for 29 years, and I had finally set it down. I had learned the fundamental difference between survival and autonomy. During my childhood, I believed that boundaries were walls. I thought they were defensive structures built out of fear, designed to hide behind when the world became too hostile. But standing in the wreckage of my parents' fraudulent kingdom, I realized that walls only trap you inside the prison with your captors. Boundaries are not walls. They are doors. You build the frame, you install the locks, you hold the only key. You decide who gets to walk through the threshold, and you decide exactly how far they are allowed to step inside your life. Patricia and Thomas had their access privileges permanently revoked. They were locked outside, standing on the lawn of a life they could no longer manipulate. If you are listening to this story and you recognize the architecture of my past, I want you to hear this clearly. If you are the scapegoat, the forgotten variable, or the child who is expected to shrink so a golden sibling can shine, you are not defective. You are not a liability. You are being miscalculated by people who cannot afford your true value. You do not owe your loyalty to people who attempt to erase you. Blood does not underwrite abuse. Genetics do not function as a promissory note for perpetual mistreatment. For years, I believed that the ultimate victory would be forcing my parents to acknowledge my worth. I thought if I accumulated enough credentials, if I conducted enough flawless audits, if I simply proved I was not the broken half of a tragic delivery room accident, they would eventually look at me with pride. I was waiting for a return on an investment I made in a bankrupt institution. The moment of true liberation arrived when I stopped waiting for their validation and started auditing my own reality. Many people believe that revenge requires destruction. They think it involves screaming matches, shattered glass, and inflicting equal amounts of pain upon the people who hurt you. But the loudest response is always silence. The best revenge is not making others suffer. The math will inevitably handle their suffering. The consequences of their own corrupted ledgers will always catch up to them. The best revenge is building a life so rich, so vibrant, and so entirely grounded in truth that their lies can no longer reach you. It is constructing a reality where their absence is not a void, but a profound structural relief. It is sitting on a sunlit porch, drinking coffee with the sister they told you was dead, and realizing that the ghost story is finally over. You are the sole architect of your future. The ledger is in your hands. Write a life that balances. To all parents, this story is a reminder that children are not assets to be pawned, nor tools to polish a family's reputation or hide personal failures. Creating a golden child who is excessively spoiled while treating another child like an outsider does not just damage both of their futures, it slowly tears apart the moral foundation of the entire family. True love is not measured by million-dollar trust funds or expensive gifts. It is found in understanding each child's unique personality, respecting their independence, and teaching them how to stand on their own feet with honesty and integrity. Do not force your children into frames you have already built for them. Instead of handing them fish bought through betrayal and manipulation, give them the fishing rod of character, wisdom, and self-respect. If you believe justice always belongs to those who refuse to break, and you want to experience more explosive confrontations, shocking family betrayals, and unforgettable revenge stories, make sure to like and subscribe to Savage Vengeance Stories. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss another satisfying journey of justice being reclaimed. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again in the next jaw-dropping story.